You're watching Open Agenda. Here's our host, Joe White.
Thanks for joining us here at Open Agenda. I'm your host, Joe White. Our show now is going to transition to covering the city government and the county government, the hearings, the politics, and the ideas that we think you need to be aware of. In the studio with me is Dr. Joe Venosa. Joe, thanks for coming out.
Thank you, Joe.
So there's three things I think we should cover in today's episode. One is the planning and zoning for the density, and this involves both the city and the county. The county council meeting that's coming up on Tuesday, November 19th, and then also kind of taking a look back at the CIP hearing that the county executive hosted at the Civic Center on Wednesday this week. But let's jump into it a little bit with this planning and zoning. I know you follow city politics a lot. Can you speak a little bit about what's coming up?
Sure. So what has been occurring over the last few months is an ongoing debate that basically is about the future of downtown development. And in very simple terms, there's an attempt by certain developer interests to revise, revamp, and change the density code for the city.
What is it currently?
I think it's 80 per unit.
I have 40 per acre.
I'm sorry, 40 per unit. It's, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they're trying to go to 80.
They're trying to go to 80. All right.
Okay.
And this is in regards to the location with certain parking lots that were sold by the city years ago, basically for nothing, that have now been bought by Brad Gillis.
Okay.
And the intention is to build basically luxury apartments.
But if they do make this change from 40 units per acre to 80, this doesn't just impact those parking lot areas. This could impact any open vacant lots in the downtown area.
It affects the whole future of city development. It's certainly going to affect, obviously, parking, but also sort of just the character and shape of downtown, and particularly businesses that are already there that are concerned. And so there is an interesting divide between certain interest groups on this topic.
Well, someone watching the show too right now who doesn't live in the city, doesn't own a business downtown, maybe doesn't even shop downtown. This could impact them too if they're a juror in circuit court, or if they're just trying to go to a public hearing.
Yep, or the library for as long as it's down there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the real heart of the matter, Joe, is that there have been attempts already to change the zoning code.
Just last year, correct?
Correct, and it failed, and they also went to court for it, meaning Brad Gillis and certain other developers were trying to change it, and it was rejected.
Yeah, Judge Jackson, his decision was pretty, there wasn't a lot of gray area in it.
No, it was thrown out.
And that was at 77 units per acre. So not that we're much difference, but now we're somehow asking for even more units per acre.
Correct.
So how would this process get approved? So obviously now they're appealing to the planning and zoning, which I think one thing that should be stated, our planning and zoning in this county actually represents the city and the county together. There's only one
amalgamation, yeah, correct. And so the theory would be then, if that were to be changed somehow, then it would go to the city council for a vote, and then they would essentially try to encourage, I guess, or direct the administration, the mayor's office, to sign off on those changes.
Well, you and I have several very reliable sources, both on the city side, the county side, and private citizens, business owners. There are a couple of things that people have talked about that they could do, the public could do to make their voice heard. One is if you Google "Don't Strangle Downtown Salisbury," you'll find the top listing will be a petition. They have over 1,000 signatures now. I think even more so, you could get information from this site to decide how you feel about it. Is that correct?
Correct. I also think it's very useful for citizens to actually watch the city council meetings over the last 2 weeks, really, because you get a better sense as to how the arguments and the interest groups that are in the community are kind of positioning themselves. There was a meeting this past week on Tuesday, and what you begin to see is, again, there's a kind of conflation on the density issue with affordable housing, meaning there's an argument that some people will be making that you can get more affordable housing if the density code is changed.
But the proposal here isn't for affordable housing.
Not
correct?
at all, and that's the point, right? Is
I
that
think that point's been made in the city council
it
meeting.
has, but there is a high degree of misinformation on that. I think people, for whatever reason, are conflating luxury apartments with affordable housing. You know, the irony is that the city, just from the city perspective, they can put in legislation that requires an affordable housing component. So if our city council president, Deshaun Doughty, and others really believe in affordable housing, they can do it through other means. This density code issue has nothing to do with that topic.
Well, and let's explore this a little bit in the air of transparency, not in the air of throwing someone under the bus, but Mr. Dowdy, he is actually employed by a developer. Is that accurate?
Correct. Green Street Housing.
So, what role? I mean, do we know if there's a role that they're playing in this at this point? I mean, he obviously is the city council president.
Sure. Not specifically them, but there have been a lot of public and private tensions between developers and particularly the mayor's office the last year. In simple terms, the previous administration under Jake Day gave away a lot of city resources to developers. And Mayor Taylor's current administration has had a much more cautious approach to some of those dealings. And there have been very recent legal entanglements between some of these developers and the city of Salisbury through the mayor's office.
Are you talking specifically the Horizon Fund program?
In part, but there were other issues. For example, Mitchell's Landing, which was low-income housing on the west side of the city, was the centerpiece of a real dispute between Green Street Housing and the city.
And that's being torn down now.
It is, but there were a lot of legal debates about sort of liability and responsibility for the sale of those units. And there was a very, very tense period not too long ago where Dave Layfield, who is the principal owner of Green Street Housing and Mr. Dowdy's employer, went to a city council meeting and in a very, and you can watch it, it's a pretty irate manner, basically went off on the mayor, went off on the city, and just threatened litigation.
Well, how would someone watch that video right now?
Sure. So the date of that particular video, and I can find it and come back for an update, but I believe it happened in, I think, September.
Okay.
And if you go to PAC 14 and just scroll down to the archived videos, much like we have county council meetings in our episode, you can find city council meetings.
Because if you're a county resident and you're not a city resident, you're thinking, well, this maybe doesn't impact me.
Oh, yeah.
But actually, this very much does.
It does, because whatever planning and zoning decides affects both entities.
Yeah, I think one of the nice, well, not nice, one of the important topics I heard is this is not a wait and see what happens moment. This is, hey, if you're any kind of a stakeholder, now is the time to make your voice heard.
Correct, and that might be a good point to then remind the public for the date and time and location for that meeting.
So planning and zoning, they actually meet at the government office building on Thursday, November 21st. So they meet every third Thursday of the month. Their meeting's at 1:30 in the afternoon. I've reached out to some county council folks, some other business owners downtown. This is not really one of those times where you can just send an email to your county council rep or your city council rep. You're going to have to show up, and you're probably going to have to be ready to speak. It's not hard to do, and there's lots of folks like you and I who are down at these meetings that will help folks do it. But at the same time, if you're ever going to be on a jury, and you want to have a parking spot downtown, or you want to go to the library while it's still down there,
or you want to have a business that you can,
have customers.
Have customers.
Well, and we've seen that. We've seen some businesses who have moved out of downtown with maybe the eye to come back, and they've flourished outside of it, and they're choosing not to. Yeah. So, I want to speak to one other thing. What is the role of the Greater Salisbury Committee and this process?
Well, I think that's one of the more problematic things. And I would say, from my own very specific biased view, I would say it's one of the more disturbing things, because we know that there are at least 4 members of the Greater Salisbury Committee that currently sit on planning and zoning. And we know that the Greater Salisbury Committee, or should I say certain elements of leadership of the Greater Salisbury Committee, are very much in favor of allowing more density changes to occur. So meaning they are definitely sort of on the side of the developers here.
So there's a lot of times this group has done a lot of positive things for the community. but their meetings are not necessarily open to the public. They're not published, and there's not necessarily public comment. There's not even minutes for the most part.
Correct.
So if you want to have your voice heard, you're going to have to come to this Planning and Zoning Committee. Right?
Correct. Yeah.
So, we kind of touched on the Horizon Fund, and in our next segment, I'd like to talk about the County Council meeting and their agenda. One of the things they have on their agenda for their next meeting is a work session about the Horizon Fund. So let's stick around for another segment, and when we come back, let's start to kind of break down that agenda and also maybe tie it back into this Planning and Zoning meeting.
Great.
Stay with us. We'll be back after this.
The 3.8-acre Witipkin Park is situated on Witipkin Creek, about 20 miles west of Salisbury. The park is improved with a concrete boat ramp that provides easy access to the Nanticoke River less than a mile downstream. Vehicle and trailer parking is adequate relative to the park's use, and there's also a soft launch for canoes and kayaks, a small picnic area, and a porta-john for your convenience. Swimming is not permitted at Witipkin Park, as the currents can be dangerously strong at times. Witipkin Creek meanders through the salt marshes and adjacent pine forests of the Witipkin Wildlife Management Area. Just beyond the low-water bridge next to the park, the creek splits into two branches, the northern prong of which is longer, extending upstream for a distance of about 4 miles. The salt marshes along Witipkin Creek support a wide variety of wildlife, mosquitoes and green-headed flies included, and harbor many different types of year-round and migratory birds throughout the seasons. The upstream area beyond the bridge is best explored by canoe or kayak, but be prepared because you can expect strong currents at times. If you're operating a motorboat heading upstream, my advice would be not to go very far. At low tide, the water becomes very shallow in spots, and you may find yourself high and dry or sucking up mud into your motor. Trust me on this, I speak from experience. Just across from the boat ramp at Witipkin Park, you'll notice the remains of docks and boat slips, which in days gone by harbored commercial oystering and crabbing boats. But in the early 1970s, after the oyster population collapsed throughout the Chesapeake Bay, the dock facility fell into disuse, and now only ghostly remnants can be seen. One of the most interesting features of Witipkin Park is the quaint wood timber bridge spanning the creek immediately adjacent to the park, which is known as the Ed Taylor Bridge. If you walk onto the bridge, you'll get a magnificent view of Witipkin Creek and the Wildlife Management Area. But please be very careful because there's no separation between vehicular and pedestrian traffic. Originally built in the early 1950s, the bridge fell into disrepair but was reconstructed and placed back into service in 2009. Ed Taylor, for whom the bridge is named, was a Wicomico County councilman, educator, and Korean War veteran who grew up in the Witipkin area and championed the bridge's reconstruction. Today, the bridge is one of his proudest legacies. For more information about Witipkin Park, please visit the Wicomico County Department of Recreation, Parks, and Tourism website.
Welcome back to Open Agenda. I'm your host, Joe White. Dr. Venosa is still in the studio with us. So, we talked about the Horizon Fund, and the next county council meeting is on November 19th. Now, this is a 10 a.m. meeting. It's also at the government office building 301. Towards the end of the meeting in the work session is going to be a work session, not a public hearing, but on the Horizon Fund program. You've been following this program for a while. Explain a little bit about what this program means and how they're trying to sunset it.
Well, basically, the county voted for this program, I want to say 4 years ago, maybe 3. It's a multi-year process, but essentially it's about development incentives.
Okay.
And now that it's run its course, the big concern is that it really hasn't financially benefited the county in any way, particularly given the fact that some of the businesses that are affiliated with the Horizons program, especially the Ross building, which is done through, I believe it's Mentis Properties, has had their own financial sort of problems recently in terms of some of their actions.
Was the goal of the Horizon Fund to especially during that time when the building wasn't fully occupied, to not force a developer to pay full property taxes and also incentivize them to invest in the
Yeah,
community.
yeah, it's sort of waiving of certain hookup fees. It's certainly about, I guess again the theory is incentivizing certain developers, excuse me, to invest more in these kinds of projects. I think the problem has always been to what extent is local government responsible for private industry to do these things when there's not a guarantee on the back end.
Well, from a political standpoint, as a conservative, it's not something that normally you see that they want to prop up a big corporation, but also usually too from the more Democrat side.
Well, as a progressive, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting that this has become an odd consensus among some, regardless of party, that we are kind of socializing certain developer interests.
Maybe the government's picking winners and losers.
Well, I think it's the essence of the concern is that, and somebody has, and there have been actually a lot of people that have brought this up, but for example, why would the Ross get a particular kind of government support when a hotel in, let's say, Fruitland doesn't get it?
But they're still building hotels in Fruitland.
Right. So clearly, commerce and development is still happening.
Well, and I think one of the nice things about the Ross is, it is nearly at capacity shortly after it opened. So, from a
it took a couple of years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in this juncture that they are actually very.
Yeah. It begs the question, why more?
Yeah. And I think the other thing that should be said is the current county council and the current city council, they're not the ones who approved this program.
Correct.
Maybe some of the members were there.
Sure.
But I know from the county council, this program passed by a 4-3 vote. It was not some sort of ringing endorsement here.
Sure. And my guess is that it would probably pass or fail by a similar vote margin.
Yeah, even now.
Yeah.
So in the very first part of the meeting, there are going to be 4 public hearings. Some of them are on, easements for land preservation and that sort of thing. But one of the bigger ones is from Parks, Rec, and Tourism. And this is to add $2.75 million to the capital budget for the exterior of the Civic Center renovations. This is a pretty impressive program or project.
Yeah.
And, obviously we were working out at the election, the early voting.
Yeah.
There's not even really a good handicap accessible ramp in the midway.
There's none.
Yeah, it's way down the corner or over by the Normandy Arena.
Yeah.
This project would actually add some safety so that the pedestrians can get across that area a lot in a lot safer manner.
Yeah.
But also modernize the box office and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I can remember when my friend Mr. John Pisota when he was acting county executive, he had presented sort of the initial schematics of it, and it was really an exciting project to see and thinking. And I believe they're going to add a cafe in there too.
Oh wow!
So
well, I think this is a great chance for the public to come and get more information. Get up for the 3 minutes and say their piece one way or another. I think one of our goals is really just to get more people involved.
And to see what's happening.
Yeah, and the more we have involved, the less likely extreme processes and programs will ever get approved because, the majority of folks are going to sit somewhere in the middle.
Yep.
Most things.
I think so.
They're also going to introduce a legislative bill 2024-12. This is going to add Chapter 99 to the Wicomico County Code, and specifically rules and regulations about vehicles that are leased or owned by the county. I remember back in November, and we put this in some of our other videos, there was a work session with the county executive and the county council where there's a big concern about how vehicles can get moved from department to department, maybe even driver to driver. What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, again, I think this is being done, unfortunately, because of past executive office policies where certain personnel have been given vehicles or have been allowed to move equipment without the public's knowledge, without a financial accounting of those actions. And so I think we're going to see this over the next few months, that the council is going to try to put a few more guardrails on some of the ability of the executive office to just have complete control over some of these important resources.
Yeah, it's not just the current executive. This has been a problem before,
This is a problem before, and what's interesting,
but it's getting worse.
It's getting worse, and it's interesting that in other Maryland counties, there's far more regulation on things as simple as vehicle allocation.
Well, many years ago, and we had Councilman Holloway in here talking about the benefits packages, healthcare and retirement amongst different departments. And at one time, many years ago, it was just a line item in the operating budget, health benefits, retirement,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. But you didn't know how much each department truly cost you until you assigned those benefits to the department they were in. So if you're trying to really figure out, hey, can we afford, Parks, Rec, and Tourism?
Right.
Or can we afford,
How much does it cost?
how much does it really cost us?
Right.
And now the vehicles, especially since the county has adopted more of a lease program, they're not broken out in the same way we're asking for benefits to be done.
Correct.
I think the other thing too, and we saw this firsthand, just being out and about in the county, is there's a lot of county vehicles that aren't marked. So if you're having misappropriation of resources,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be funds; it can be vehicles.
Sure.
If they're not marked, then we don't know. Right.
Right. And it also goes into other scenarios, like, hypothetically, what if somebody from the executive office was in a car accident with a particular vehicle? What if that vehicle had been, let's say, in the process of being planned to be used by somebody else?
Yeah.
If somebody's using it in an unregulated manner and we can't account for it, that just from the logistics of our resources.
Well, we've recently had an employee from the executive's office in a car accident,
Really?
and not that there was any fault,
Okay.
but at the same time, from an air of transparency, if you own a business and you let one of your employees drive that vehicle, the business owner is taking the risk.
Yeah.
Obviously, the person driving is also taking somewhat of a risk, but
Yeah.
the business owner is taking a risk. Well, in this case, the taxpayers are the business owner.
Correct.
These are our resources.
Correct.
They're not made to be passed out and that sort of thing, it willy-nilly.
Yeah. Yeah.
The public comment section at the county council meeting, I think also would be very pertinent when we're tying this back to the planning and zoning that we were just talking about for the city and the county that's combined on November 21st. There will be an opportunity for public comment at the county council meeting on the 19th, which is 2 days before. Those public comments are really open for any topic. You're not supposed to be derogatory or attack anybody, but this is a great opportunity for someone who says, hey, you know what, I can't come out to planning and zoning on the 21st at 1:30, but I can make the 10 o'clock meeting.
Right.
Really want people to take advantage of that, correct?
It's a great point.
Yeah. So we had one other hearing yesterday, and in our last segment, I'd like to discuss that. That was the county executive did host a capital improvement plan hearing at the Civic Center. Several folks attended and took the opportunity to speak. So in our last segment, I think we should cover that.
Sounds good.
All right. So in our last segment, we're going to talk about the capital improvement plan, what was said, and also how that's going to impact the budget process in the spring. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Open Agenda. Our last segment today with Dr. Jovanosa, we're going to talk about the capital improvement hearing that the county executive just hosted. So talk a little bit about why these types of public hearings are important and why people should show up.
Sure. Well, the CIP, or the Capital Improvement Plan, is basically a series of, I guess you could say, goals and sort of like a wish list that the executive branch would lay out for the public regarding priorities and, sort of things that they believe the county should invest in the future. Why it's important is because members of the public, right, who have an interest in certain things, whether it's the construction of a school or a park or priority funding for a department, let's say, have an opportunity to both critique the initial CIP that's been delivered and also provide perhaps additional comments or concerns.
Well, one of my favorite parts about yesterday's hearing, well, one, that we had it. I wish it was publicized better.
Yes, that's been a common critique that others have said recently,
Yeah.
that it wasn't widely known.
Well, but before the meeting started, Director of Finance Pam Olin did take some time to talk about what is considered a capital project, how some of these projects got on the initial list. In no way, shape, or form were they trying to say this was a final list, or even maybe even trying to insinuate it was in any kind of certain order.
Sure.
But there were questions raised about information. You take, for instance, the Mason-Dixon Sports Complex. I know from going to Parks and Rec meetings that there is a number associated with that renovation of the Mason-Dixon Sports Complex. They know what it would cost in today's dollars. Now, you can project out that, hey, if we decide not to do this until 2029, pick an inflation number. You're probably going to be wrong, but because who knows inflation.
Yeah.
But at least you have some sort of guide.
Right.
Our current CIP does not have that and has not had that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and again, the idea that you have a capital improvement plan and don't have those numbers baked in, even just sort of different scenarios to project out, is kind of strange.
It's really strange when you consider that in the Parks Rec meeting, they do have the number. Now, they don't have it mapped out for 4 or 5, 6 years.
Sure.
That's what I would hope a finance department would do. But I will say that they did discuss this last night. Board of Education is the ones who came up with their capital improvement ideas. So the ones you saw on there didn't just come out of thin air. They came from Board of Education, which is where they should come from.
Correct. Yeah.
Parks and Rec came from Parks and Rec. I think as a taxpayer who wants to see our tax dollars, one, spent well, but also want to see as many amenities as we can afford and afford to maintain, you need this information, because at the end of the day, you don't know, am I deciding on 5 different park projects or one school?
Right.
Well, if the school is Fruitland Primary and in the shape it was in, you may have to put aside 5 park projects. But if you are going to all of a sudden start 5 park projects, it might be good to know that, hey, this isn't as much money as it seems, because they're smaller numbers.
It's the basics of budgeting, right? Is, okay, if you know the numbers you're working with, even in a general sense, then we can figure out what our priorities and allocations are.
Yeah.
And without those numbers, it makes it sort of, it turns it from a CIP to a Christmas wish list.
Well, right now I'd say we are more of a Christmas wish list.
I agree.
Now, several folks from the Board of Education stood up and spoke early in the hearing.
Yeah.
And one of the things I learned, and I did not know this from going to work sessions, being in the budget process that happened last spring for the current fiscal year, is that they take Fruitland Primary School, for instance. A lot was added into that school. It's not really just a school. There's a health center. There's a food pantry.
Yeah.
They're planning on those facilities being used for after-school programs, but also Parks and Rec programs. Sure. Again, in the air of transparency, isn't it really important to understand what our tax dollars are being spent on?
Absolutely.
I had no idea that the total price tag of Fruitland Primary School is $56 million. Now, some of that will be reimbursed by the state, although it was really kind of hard to understand how that process worked. I hope some of this gets explained in these future meetings that will happen between now and the spring when we do the next set of budget process.
Yeah.
And I want to talk more about that in a minute. But at the same time, having been at these meetings recently, at no point in time did they naturally come up. They didn't. So let's talk a little bit about what's next on the process. So this CIP, we've had the hearing. It now takes the executive to submit this to the county council sometime during the winter, before the operating budget starts.
Correct.
Last year, there were some hurt feelings, as far as how robust the CIP was, and understanding lots of rhetoric going around that it wasn't.
Just a bit.
Yeah, just a little bit. But the public really should get involved in this stage, because this is going to lead to the operating budget being decided on. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think the context of that involvement also matters, because, again, we are in a system, and this would have been true regardless of the recent results of the ballot question, but right now the executive office has sole discretionary power over setting the budget, the CIP, and there are limits on what the council can do. So if you have more public pressure, if you have more of an actual just sort of motivated public to get involved, to understand, what is the proposal, what do we want, what are we worried about. That kind of public pressure and push for transparency could have a real effect on some of these projects.
Well, and I think at this point, that's exactly what we're hoping on. Obviously, we're disappointed in the election results. Really respect the voters for deciding to continue with the executive branch.
Sure.
But ultimately, our goal to push for question A was for transparency.
Sure.
So this didn't pass.
Yeah.
So we need to work on it a different way.
Sure.
Right?
Sure. And I think you have to keep in mind, too, that almost 47% of county residents right now think that the executive position shouldn't exist still. Yeah. So in a sense, it's going to really be on the executive office and the county to some extent to prove that this system that we've continued down and just voted to continue, even more so, can still work. And so I think part of that essential process is more transparency. It has to be community having interest, but it also has to have people asking the right kinds of questions about where their tax dollars go and who has the authority to make big decisions that affect thousands of people.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give the county executive a lot of credit. We had the hearing yesterday. So now we're at the first stage of a 5-month process. Mm-hmm. We need public input. We need our elected leaders to hear it and implement as many of those ideas as possible.
Yeah.
One of the questions I would love to ask, and you're not going to get it answered in one meeting, is we agree we need schools. I mean, you're going to have to build schools. Population increases, schools age out. But should schools even cost $56 million? Mm-hmm. How does that process going to work? Because we're also dealing with one other really impactful part of our lives right now is our state is facing over a $2 billion budget deficit.
Correct.
So that's not going to happen in a vacuum.
It's not, and that's also juxtaposed with national trends because we're going to have big political changes coming, and there's big economic concerns about what deficits and tax rates and future inflation may or may not look like. So you've got uncertain times for the state, uncertain times for the country, and let's be honest, we've had a substantially increased budget over recent years in just the county. And so when we're looking at, again, what do we prioritize and why does it cost a certain amount of money, understanding not just what a priority is, but understanding what that priority funding actually goes to is really important.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, and we covered this back in the summer when we had the president of the council, John Cannon, here. A lot of folks, they want to talk about the revenue cap holding back spending, but in fact, that's not the biggest part of the pie with this county. Right. That the income tax, the piggyback tax, it is, and so we have been able to grow the operating budget. Maybe we're not all happy with where those priorities, those buckets that money was put in, but let's get people involved. Let's get people there. Reach out to your city council rep, your county council rep.
Go to meetings.
Just go to meetings. Yeah. Just watch and observe. One of the most powerful things last night at the CIP hearing, I mean, maybe only 15 or 16 people got up and spoke, but there were over 50 people there. Eyes and ears on our elected officials. It does not matter your political party. We all live here. We all need to be a part of it.
And regardless of whether you live in a municipality or not, that's the other thing I think we tend to forget.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
All right. Well, thanks for coming out. Look, we're going to keep this conversation going. Yeah. What we're hoping for is some interaction. So come out to the meetings. You'll see us there for the most part. And if you have questions about how it is to get up and speak, we're happy to explain it. We're not the only ones there. There are other folks as well. So thanks for joining us for this edition of Open Agenda. We'll be back next week with another new episode. We think Mark Carroll is the best editor ever.